Hey folks, T's Daily. I'm back with you again. Thanks for tuning in. This is continuing on with the Tranzistow overview videos, and in this particular case we're going to take a look at the filters and the different sections that contain the filters and just the various options and parameters it has. So there's a fair bit to get through, so it may be a fairly lengthy video, and I thought about breaking it up into multiple videos covering each filter, and I thought, nah, it's probably going to be a bit too much, so I'll probably move pretty rapidly through each of these. I'll try and just cover enough, give enough information to people that just want to get started, because that was kind of the point of these videos, was not to get too in-depth with everything, because there's just so much to unpack that would just be extensively long to cover every facet and detail, and it would just take up too much time. So we're going to take a look at each of the main filters, the comb filters and the morphing filter section, and we'll go through those each separately, but like I said, I may move pretty quickly, so if there's something I miss, overlook, or perhaps get wrong or something, do feel free to drop a line in the comments and set the record straight, or ask questions or whatever. So let's just get into it. So we'll load up a initial patch for now. Well, I'll probably load up a few presets that demonstrate some of the features and functions later on as we go. And for now we're going to take an initial preset and just look at the modules firstly on the oscillator main tab, and you can see filter B down the bottom is engaged, and we're going to take a look at filter A firstly. So we'll turn filter A on and disable filter B, and then we'll turn the mixer on. No, actually we won't. We'll leave the mixer off, sorry, and we'll go to the filter amp tab. So this is the main page where you will see all of your parameters for the two main filter sections, which are filter A and B. And we'll go through each of these separately, but firstly we'll look at filter A. But also on this page we have the amplifiers, and down the bottom we'll need to turn the filter A section up on amplifier 1, and take filter B down for now. So you can hear that's the initial sawtooth coming through from the auxiliary oscillator 1, and that's now coming through filter A number 1 here. So you can see that these two separate filter banks, A and B, each have made up of 4 independent filters that are tied to the audio lanes that we discussed in the last video. So filter A section deals with a few different types of state variable filters. So each of these 4 filters, 1, 2, 3, and 4, are identical. They're tied to each of the audio lanes, the main audio paths. So to go through the different types of filters for filter A, you need to go back to the OS main tab, and then to the second page. So left click the header again, and you see down the bottom we have this filter C button or option, and you can click this and keep clicking it to cycle through the different modes in which you can have filter A operate as. So I think there's 5 different main filter types that you can select from. By default, they're all state variable filters, so they're all sort of fairly similar, with sort of some character differences between them, and I'll go through them. So we have the main default mode is based somewhat on the Waldorf Q, and I think it's the Alesis Andromeda. But being state variable filters, we have simultaneous kind of filter types that you can mix and work with, you know, low pass, high pass, and band pass that I speak of. And each of those, they're pretty much the same for each mode. So we have another couple of modes, which are filter C and filter H, which are somewhat different in that they have some internal kind of like processing, like dynamic processing, which I think filter C has internal clipping, and then the filter H has an internal limiter with some saturation. So they're slightly different, but quite similar to each other. And then the other two modes we have there are filter Q and then filter X. These ones are labelled somewhat as more sort of analog in style, so I sort of suspect they have more kinds of non-linearities in the distortion and just the sort of resonance characteristics and behaviours. But again, they're all sort of fairly similar. It's like sort of subtle differences, you know. So just go through them. You've got two different modes for some of these, which are the 12 and the 24 mode, which sort of deals primarily with the stages, which I'll get to. Main tab. So each of these four filters work with two stages in each filter, which you can see down here. We have these parameters level 12 and level 24. So these correspond to the two stages of each of these filters. It represents 12 dB per octave as a slope, like a filter slope, and then 24 dB per octave, which means 24 dBs per octave is going to be a stronger kind of filtering. It's a steeper slope. So going back to these modes, you can see you can kind of lock these into one of those stages if that's, you know, how you want to work. So we'll just leave that in default for the remainder going through, but do go and explore those different filter types, because you may find you enjoy one or, you know, particular type more than others. So we'll sort of work through the parameters. So we have at the top, we have the main sort of filter parameters you would expect, being the cutoff frequency and the resonance amount. And this is self-explanatory. We have a gain parameter, which is the input gain to the filter. Beneath that, we have two parameters for feedback relating to each of these stages, as I spoke of. So feedback 12 for the 12 dB stage, and then feedback 24 for the 24 dB stage. And then each of these also has a sort of a wave shaper or feedback shaper menu. You can choose all of these different waveforms or audio sources that you can use to shape the feedback for each of these stages. So definitely worth exploring and experimenting with, because you can really shape the character of the filter through these feedback parameters. So underneath you have the main outputs for each of these filter types. So each filter has the three filter types, being low pass, high pass, and band pass. And like I said, you can mix and use these simultaneously, and yeah, you're not tied to using one at a time like you would be with the filter B filters. Okay, so I'll just mention now we've got several pages of parameters to get through, and this is the first main page. And these outputs here actually have a bearing on both of these stages. So if we turn both of these outputs up and use these output levels, it will effectively pass the output through both of those stages. But there are provisions which are on the second and third pages for using each of these stages independently. Okay, so if we go to the second page, you can see these output parameters are now numbered with the 12 denominator, or the denominator, I mean. So we've got low pass 12, high pass 12 and band pass 12, and it relates to the 12 dB stage. So these are only going to output the signal to that particular stage. So the third page gives you the same thing, but with the 24 dB per octave stage. So that allows us to sort of mix and match different filter types per stage as well. So it just really gives you more flexibility and opens up sort of more complex routings for filter types, and just it just really allows you to experiment and explore different kinds of filtering all within the one filter. So we'll go back to the second tab. So we still have the cutoff on this page as well, which is nice and easy to access. We have a routing parameter which allows us to configure the routing of the two stages of these filters. So all the way at the maximum one value by default, they're routed in series. So I think it's passing, the outputs pass through the 24 dB stage followed by the 12 dB stage. And then if we bring this routing parameter back over to the minimum of 0, they're now configured in parallel, so you'll find that you can it's just a different mix of the filter types, so one's not going to affect the other. Under that we have velocity amount, so we can add velocity control to the cutoff frequency. Then we have curve 12 limit, so this, and curve 24 limit. So this is these are limiters for the wave shaping section of the feedback control. So we can just tame the point at which the wave shaping happens. Again, we've got access to the menu of waveforms we can select. So down the bottom, under the output parameters, we have the two resonance amount controls for each stage. And these are pretty self-explanatory. These just basically attenuate the range of resonance that each stage is going to have. So I typically leave it at maximum, which gives you the full range of resonance. And then if you bring it down to 0, it means that you don't get any kind of resonance behavior. And you can sort of set it anywhere in between, as far as controlling the range of resonance. So we'll move on to the last page of filter A. And here we see we have these chain parameters, and these allow us to cascade these 4 different filters together in a chain. And the routing's fixed, so you can't sort of mix and match the routing as you would. You can't really choose to sort of route them as you want. You're tied to these particular configurations. So the 4th filter output will feed into filter 1. Filter 1's output feeds into filter 2. Filter 2's output feeds to filter 3. And then filter 3's output feeds back into filter 4. But that's basically a useful sort of option for having like extensive and more complex filtering systems, and you can chain them together to create steeper slopes and steeper filters and so on. So under this we have a distance parameter, and this allows us to offset the sort of the distance between each of the two stages cutoff frequency. Okay, so the cutoff frequency between the two stages can be somewhat offset with this distance parameter. I'm not too sure exactly how it works as far as which sort of stage is moving in relation to the other or what, but that's just my understanding. So moving on, we have another two parameters dealing with the curve of the feedback wave shaping, or the feedback shaping. So I'm not exactly 100% sure how these work either, but they're definitely worth tweaking when you're experimenting with the feedback and the feedback shaping parameters. You know, you can get some very kinds of significant timbre changes just by using those parameters together. Okay, so again, we've got the menus for the feedback shaping options for each stage. We've got the outputs here on this page for the 24 dB stage, and at the bottom we have curve symmetry for each stage, which relates to the curves of the feedback shaping. So these can give us more control over the harmonics that are generated through the feedback. So again, that's just worth sort of experimenting with. Probably just try and give you a bit of a rough audio demo quickly before we move on to filter B, but here's a cutoff just there, sort of simply, and then adding some resonance. Turn it up. So this is just a low pass coming through both stages at the same time, and they're routed. I think they're routed in serial mode through the. Oh no, they're in parallel. Sorry. So now they're in series. You can hear that sort of difference. So if we go back to the first page, we'll turn this down. We'll use two different filters on each stage. Low pass on the 12 dB stage, and we'll use these. Sorry. I think we're just hearing the low pass 12 dB stage there. So if we go to the third page, and we'll add a high pass for this stage. So now we're going to get more of a, it'll end up sounding like a notch. But if we go back to the second page, go back into series, we can now get that more of a notch kind of sound. So if we start adding some sort of feedback, and we'll adjust some of these feedback parameters. You get a lot of self-oscillation type behavior if you drop the gain down a bit and use a sort of moderately high amount of resonance. You can hear like the distortion created by the feedback here. And if we use a you can hear that offset between the filters with the distance. So they're quite close. But I'm still not 100% sure which filter is actually moving, but if someone knows, do let us know in the comments. So we'll change the wave shape. We'll use something, one of these interesting waves down here. So you can hear that we're getting some pretty gnarly distortion. So I'll sort of make note now, and this sort of applies to all of the filters through Tranzistow. If you're dealing with the feedback, the wave shaping, and particularly when we start looking at the driver and shaper modules, the wave shaper modules, which I'll briefly cover soon, but when you start playing with these and combining, experimenting with the different parameters, you may find it worth your while putting on a limiter. So if we put a peak limiter on here, I'll drop the ceiling down somewhat, because you can easily get some wild, crazy signals that'll, you know, potentially cause damage to your speakers or your ears. So just bear that in mind when you start experimenting with feedback. You know, you just got to be careful. So lots of noisy type distortion there. So it can get pretty hectic. And if we look at some of these other controls, curve, shift, you can get some really kind of erratic behavior, and like I said, be careful, because you can sort of easily create some really untamed signals. But yeah, this sort of just gives you a quick sort of gist of some of what you can do. There's obviously a lot more there to explore, so you can do that in your own time, but we'll move on. So that was the filter A section. We'll start looking at filter B now, which basically relates to the right hand side of the page, as you can see. So again, we've got a few extra filters in this particular section. So instead of just having 4, which you have in filter A, like the 4 lanes of audio, we've got the 4 transistor ladder filters in this section, which tied to the main audio paths again. And we also got 2 diode ladder filters, which are tied up to lanes 1 and 2. So we've got 6 different filters that operate in filter B section. Okay, so these are of the these are of ladder type. So these behave differently to the state variable filters in the filter A section. Okay, so the transistor ladder filters, which you'll find in across the 4 lanes, are the most flexible in that you've got all these different filter types that you can choose from in this menu. So you've got low pass, high pass, band stop, phase shift. There's quite a few different options there to go and explore. I won't go through all of these in detail because it's just beyond the scope of the video. But the beauty of the ladder filters is that it gives you control of the poles. You can see it down the bottom, in the bottom sort of section, these pole parameters. And unless you dial in the kind of behavior of the filter to some extent, like as far as the steepness and the depth of the filtering, you know. So you can dial in, you know, tame sort of 6 dB per octave filters just with 1 pole, or you can increase the other poles to make the filter steeper all the way through to like a 24 dB per octave filter slope, which is, you know, relatively steep. And you can get anywhere in between, you know, so you can go from 6 to 12 to 18 to 24 dB through these different stages or poles. So the thing is too, we're basically limited to one filter type just by the selection. You can't mix these filter types like you can with the state variable. But like I said, the flexibility is in where the poles and the control over the slope of the filter. So again, we've got the resonance, cutoff and resonance, the main sort of parameters you expect. We've also got parameters in filter B section relating to the wave shaper modules, which are the driver and the shaper modules, which you can see back on the OS main tabs with the modules at the bottom. So if we turn these on, these will now start to take effect. So the driver, they're both wave shaper modules and they're very similar to each other, but they're just situated in different points in the signal flow or the chain. So the driver module is situated before the filter. It's pre-filter. So if you do use that, the signal coming out of the driver will feed into the input of the filter. And then the shaper is a wave shaper that follows the filter. So the output from the filter then feeds into the shaper if you decide to use it. Now the drive parameter also affects the level or the gain of the input to the filters. Like that's both filters A and B without even being turned on. Okay, so you can use that to sort of drive the input to the filters without actually using the wave shaping parameters. So yeah, we've got the driver mount, and then we've got the drive curve, which you can again select from all the different waveforms and the signal inputs, outputs. So again, you've got a great degree of wave shaping capabilities, and when you combine all three, like the driver with the filters and the shaper, you really got just extensive control over timbral shaping, and it's pretty crazy just how far you can just push the sounds, so definitely explore them, because they sound excellent, and yeah, like I said, they just add all these extra dimensions to this synth. So I guess we'll move on. We've got the gain, which relates to the input gain of the filter. We've got filter A input, so we can route the signals coming out of filter A into filter B if we choose to with this. Which is nice if you want to cascade these different filters together. Then we've also got feedback amount controls, very similar to what we looked at with the filter A section. And we have a Q compensate parameter. Okay, so this relates to the behavior of ladder filters in general. So what happens with the ladder filter is typically you get attenuation of the frequencies under the cutoff frequency when you start pushing the resonance up. So you'll notice a dip in low frequencies and bass sounds when you start pushing the resonance. So this Q compensate just compensates for that kind of behavior. So the filter A state variable filters don't suffer from this kind of behavior. So it may be desirable, it just depends on your usage, but it's nice to have this compensation parameter there to sort of alleviate that dropout if you sort of finding you need that low end. So again, we've got the pole parameters, which I kind of explained earlier, and then we've got the output level at the bottom. Followed by the shaper curve, which relates to the shaper module, the wave shaper that follows the filters. So again, you can use these curves and waveforms to, it just creates different kinds of distortion characteristics. So second page, we get driver limit and driver curve parameters, very similar to the feedback parameters we looked at with the filter O section. The diode routing relates to how you would configure the two, because like I explained, we have on lanes 1 and 2, we have two separate filters in filter B, which are the transistor ladder and then the diode ladders. So this routing parameter allows us to route the diode filter either pre or post transistor ladder filter, I believe. We have more feedback parameters, much the same as we saw with the filter A section. We have a normalize, which I think is like a signal normalization level you can set to. I haven't really used that myself, but guess it could be useful. Diode distance, I think, is very similar to the distance in that we were looking at with the filter A section. So if you're using the two filters on lanes 1 and 2, like if you're using the diode ladder as well as the transistor ladder, you can sort of offset the distance between the two filters, or the cutoff frequency between the two filters. Again, we've got access to the poles again. I think pole int init, I think that's the initial point of the pole. I'm not too sure on these parameters, to be quite honest. Like, it's all getting very deep and technical, but it's just more degrees of control over the poles of each stage of these filters. So again, we've got the shaper limiter and filter cross. I'm guessing that's cross modulation between the diode and the ladder filters. I may be wrong, so if someone knows if that's right or wrong, do let everyone know in the comments. Excuse me. So we'll move to the third page, and on the third page we have access to the diode ladder filter parameters. So again, we've got the cutoff, the resonance, and I'm not sure if the cutoff is the same parameter as the other pages. I'll just double check that, and it is. So yeah, like I was saying, that distance, diode distance parameter, just allows us to offset the distance between the cutoff frequencies of both the diode and the ladder filters. So they're basically tied up to the same cutoff and resonance controls. Yeah, so again, we've got more driver parameters, like the shift, and we've got the curve again. So these are just all useful to explore when you're using the driver for wave shaping. We've got further feedback controls, again very similar to what we've looked at already. We've got pole, so it looks like the diode filters only have the 3 poles, I think, and then we have the shaper shift for the wave shaper module. So you find these parameters, they're all kind of, they seem to be scattered around a bit, which is kind of, it's a little bit annoying, but I mean, it's nice to have the parameters, but I guess it would have been nice to have them all more sort of uniformly together, as you know, as far as the modules go. And we also have the chain parameters, much like the chain parameters from filter A. You can cascade these together in this kind of configuration. And the saturate amount relates to the shaper module, the degree of shaping. And that pretty much covers the basics of the filter B section. So I guess we'll just take a quick listen to some demos before we move on. So what? Trying to work out why I have no signal. If we turn filter B on, that might help. So now we've got filter B. We'll turn the driver and the shaper on. We'll sort of give a rough idea of some of these behaviors of these modules. So filter B. You can hear that's really quite a raw, sort of aggressive sound, but try the high pass. Yeah, so combining the outputs of the different poles just really lets you get some very interesting kinds of phase shifting and interesting filtering characteristics. So we start using some different waveforms for the wave shaping. We go to the second page for the other driver parameters. We've got, actually it might be the third page. Try a few different waveforms. And the saturator, which follows the filter. So we start using the diode filter as well. Turn that on with the third page on the oscillator main tab. I'll turn the ladder filters off actually, so you just hear the diode filters. So we'll just take this back to transistor there. I think it's to do with the routing, the diode. Okay, so I think the diode routing parameter actually just allows us to either route to the filter, the diode filter, or to go around it. Because I'm pretty sure it just fits in before the transistor ladder, like in the kind of the signal flow and the path. So you can hear that character is quite different too. Oh, nice. But what we'd notice with the diode filters, you're limited to low pass types of filtering. Like they only operate as low pass filters of, you know, types of different orders. So nice to have, and combined with the transistor ladder filters. So heaps there to explore. But yeah, we'll move on. This is probably dragging on a bit. So the next section is the cone filters. So we've got 4 independent cone filters, again tied to the 4 audio paths. And these are on the LFO cone page. Now these are quite useful for various types of effects and just synthesis methods. You can use these quite effectively for several types of physical modeling, types of synthesis. So, excuse me, we can get some really nice kinds of plucked string sounds or sort of blown wind instrument sounds, as well as just like typical kinds of like cone filtering applications where you would get sort of the phasing, flanging type of effects. And I won't go too far into theories of, or the theory of cone filters, but with each of these, you can operate these in 2 separate modes, which are feedback and feed forward mode. So on the second page of parameters, you can see we've got the forward button, which switches the mode of the filter. And effectively, it just shifts the notches across the spectrum to create a different sort of characteristic kind of cone filtering. But we typically have the main parameters you expect with cone filters, namely the frequency, the feedback amount, the delay time, and a damping parameter, which allows us to attenuate the high frequencies being fed back through the filter. So I guess like there's a few really nice presets that come with Tranzistow that really show off the sort of the facets of the cone filters. So I guess we'll load up some of these and have a look. So this comb hoover is really, it's quite a nice patch that really shows how you can route the signal through the different audio paths through the synthesizer. So we'll take a look at that. And this is what it sounds like. So this is just more or less using the oscillators coming into mixer 1, feeding through cone filter 1. So adjusting the frequency. Hear that cone filtering effect. But following that, it goes through ring mod 2 over here. You can see the second ring mod has the cone filter 1 output coming in, which seems to be multiplied with this constant. And then that's actually fed to filter A, I believe. So I think on the second page, sorry, maybe the third page, we can see filter 2 side input A is cone 1. So ring mod 3 is taking the output from filter A. That was number 2. So filter A's output is coming into ring mod number 3. And then on the amps section, we can see amplifier number 2's input is just coming from ring mod 3. So if we turn that down, we lose the signal. So it sort of gives you an idea of how you can route the signal around the instrument as well through different filters. Some other presets that kind of show the physical modeling kinds of aspects. So I think comb tracking shows that it's basically fed back delay. So obviously there's some input signal coming from auxiliary oscillators by the looks of it, which isn't quite what I had in mind, but what I do have is another patch. Actually, I've got my own patch. It's comb harp, which will show how you can create sort of plucked string type sounds with the combs. So this is more or less a noise burst coming through filter A with a very, very sharp short envelope fed into a comb filter with very high feedback. And you can hear that damp, how that damp parameter damps the high frequencies. I have 2 of these set up in stereo, so one's for each side of the stereo field. So that can give you a bit of an idea on how you can use the comb filters. The final part for this video, we're going to take a look at the morphing filter section, which is pretty interesting. So the last section is hidden in this Mixer FM tab. So if you hold shift and click the header, you enter the filter morph page, and this page is, well, it's made up of 4 independent morphing filter banks. Each of these are obviously tied to the 4 audio paths. So each of these morph banks are made up of 8 individual morphing filters. Okay, so what you get is 8 independent filters. They each can be, you can select a filter type from a sort of basic selection of filter types here. And there's a basic set of parameters for each. Now these are quite a bit simpler than the 2 main filter sections, but that being so, they're also a lot less demanding on the CPU. So it might be a good idea if you've just if you're just wanting very simple kinds of filtering effects. These are good options to look at, you know, as far as efficiency goes. So you've just got your filter types that you can choose from. You've got your cutoff frequency, the Q bandwidth or resonance, and then you've got the gain, or the input gain, just on the first sort of page of parameters, and that's the same for each of these 8, which will be the same again for each of the 4 banks. Okay, so the second page gives us a secondary set of filters that we can choose. Okay, so these are the other filters that you can morph to and from. Okay, so the first page gives you 1 filter type, and then the second page gives you a second, and then you can actually morph between these 2 different filter types, and you can, you know, have 8 separate morphing filters, so to speak. Again, we've got the same parameter set. The third page gives us input and output gain parameters, and then the chain parameter, which, to be honest, I'm not quite sure how this works as far as how they chain, or whether they chain these filters together or not. I'm not too certain on how that works, but in my experiments using these parameters, I've found it they very easily lead to wild kinds of signals that overload, and will overload your system. So bear that in mind. It's wise to chuck a peak limiter on if you're going to start experimenting with those. But what you can do, it will just show you quickly a demonstration of the morphing features. If we select a low pass on page 1, we'll just use filter 1 just to demonstrate this, because each of these 8 are basically the same. So we go to the second page, we can choose a secondary type of filter, and we'll choose notch, and then okay, so to morph between them we need to use the mod matrix. So we go to the matrix 16 page, gives us the first 16 slots of modulation. Now actually I will initialize the preset before I demonstrate this. So we're going to turn on the morphing filters. So turn that on here with the modules section again. I'll just make sure that's going to work. We need to select these filter types again. Go notch. So that's working. So we've got low pass there, and then the secondary filters and notch. So if we go to the matrix again, we'll just put an LFO in for now, and parameters for morphing the filters are these morph filter parameters. So we've got morph 1 bank. So these 4 let you morph between all of the 8 filters at once, like simultaneously, or you can select from each of the filters independently to morph each one, separately. So that's, fair bit of flexibility there if you want to do different kinds of morphing between the, across the whole different range of filters. We'll just go with morph bank 1 for now. We'll increase that modulation amount. Turn LFO rate up. You can start to hear that modulation. And on the second page we can so you get some really interesting kinds of shifting and filtering. Definitely lots of fun to explore. I guess I'll note now that you can't really modulate the parameters of these filters, or not the frequency at least, or the resonance, which is a bit of a shame, but I think that's to do with just cutting down on how heavy it would be on the CPU. So like I said, they're just simpler in their nature, but using those morph abilities is very interesting. So it's just, I guess, you just need to work out how you want to go about filtering with your patches. So that's about it. I think that's mostly what you would need to get started with using those filters anyway. So again, I'll wrap this up. And if you've got comments, criticisms, queries, questions, anything like that, always feel free to drop them in the comments, and I look forward to seeing them. So leave it there. I think next time we'll take a look at the modulation section, which will entail the LFOs and the envelopes and the contour generators, and we'll probably revisit the oscillators because there were some few things I overlooked with regards to those, but that kind of ties in with the LFOs and envelopes anyway. So I guess we'll cover that, and that'll probably also entail the mod matrix and yeah, just the modulation aspects of using Tranzistow. So thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you then.